Reversing global warming is expensive. Funds are needed not just for mitigation, retreat and adaptation, but also for the repair work along the way caused by catastrophic events. This reality is leading towards a much greater need to assess the impact of global warming and the transition to net zero on the economy. Joining us now with more is Professor Tim Harcourt, Chief Economist at the Institute for Public Policy and Governance at the University of Technology, Sydney. Tim, it's wonderful to have you with us today. Welcome. Now, are we putting enough emphasis on this parallel economic dilemma, effectively the cleanup cost versus the transition cost?
Thanks, Oro, for having me on the show. Yeah, look, it's a big challenge. You know, for Australia, we want to put the green back in the green and gold in terms of energy transition. But of course, as you say, you know, it's the world's biggest externality, you know, beyond borders. And so whilst in Australia we can plough ahead, we do have in the short term the impacts of climate events and, you know, having to look after our neighbours in the Pacific, for instance, you know, when there are events. So I think there's a bit of a balancing of the long-term transition and also the short-term, you know, cleaning up issues locally, whether they be bushfires and floods that we've had here in Australia or events beyond our shores.
Now, Tim, the UN's position is that first world rich nations should essentially support developing countries in this global effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. Is this reasonable? Is it rational? Is it essential?
Well, they're going to try, and you know, naturally the UN wants to bring people together and certainly lift the profile of the issue and the urgency of it. I think there are a couple of problems in that. I mean, I can see regional partnerships here in the Pacific for Australia, given the good relationships we have locally and the scale of it would be possible. But I think at the UN, trying to do huge compensation payments from the industrialised world to the developing world would be very difficult and also could be problematic. As we know, institutions really matter. When you look at the book Why Nations Fail and Why Australia Prospered, the institutions that you have economically, how markets function, how government and governance functions, and how democracy functions really matters. So you could be making compensation payments that may not have any impact on global warming and could be captured by rents of elites in different developing countries. So if the institutions are weak and dysfunctional, then it's not going to go anywhere, and it may not even help the world's poor. And that's the dilemma we have to be careful of when we look at these types of arrangements.
So that then leads to an even bigger question. So from an economist's point of view, Tim, how do we manage the way forward? Because clearly drastic action is required.
I think it's a matter of providing good incentives, and I think that's where carbon credits and sustainable finance is working quite well. I think the central banks, for all the blame they're getting for interest rates and inflation, they're actually doing a reasonable job on looking at the greening of the financial system. I mean, Guy Debelle, very prominent Deputy Governor of the RBA, moved to Fortescue, of course. So I think that's part of it, the incentives in the financial and economic system. And also, I think, to some extent, Oreo, I think the governance of international institutions. One thing I've noticed is that some institutions want to set great targets and make great pronouncements, like the UN and some of the things that are going on at COP27. But a lot of companies and small businesses are actually doing quite a good job at putting the green back in the green and gold and responding to the bushfires and responding to the challenges that we're facing. So I think in some ways looking at those incentives and looking at the contributions of the private sector and the community sector gives me quite good reasons for optimism when facing the challenges of climate change.
So, Tim, given all of those considerations that we've just been discussing, and very glad to hear that you are optimistic at this point in time, there's a huge amount of stake. So when you look at the global situation, which countries, which cities are really leading the way when it comes to transitioning to net zero and managing that collateral damage from the legacy economic growth inputs?
Well, I saw it in the Airport Economist Climate Innovation Special, your hometown of Brisbane, Oriel, with tritium that has been providing battery powers to vehicles. Even helped James Cameron, the Hollywood producer, getting his submarine to the bottom of the sea. So places like Queensland in Australia have been very prominent. South Australia, in particular, that hosted the hydrogen conference recently is part of the story. And then offshore, we've seen, particularly in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, the urban centres of Kuala Lumpur, Thailand, and Vietnam playing a pretty prominent role. China and India themselves, of course, got 1 billion people each, and some huge challenges. But India's been very good at looking at green cities and green transportation in terms of its own urbanisation, and China's looking very carefully at renewable energy as well. And I found with the airport economist hydrogen specials, South Korea and Japan have been pretty prominent because of their energy dependence.
Tim, we really appreciate your time today. It's always good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us here on the APAC Network.
Thanks, Oriel. Great to be with you.
Professor Tim Harcourt with us there from the University of Technology, Sydney.